If you're enjoying this tale of the Old West, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories from the frontier. Your support helps us bring these forgotten legends to life. The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the endless expanse of red rock and sagebrush. Heat waves shimmered like ghostly dancers across the desert floor, distorting the distant mesas into wavering mirages. In this unforgiving landscape, where survival meant the difference between life and death, two unlikely souls were about to cross paths. Margaret Whitmore pressed her silk handkerchief against her parched lips, tasting the bitter dust that had settled there during 3 days of relentless travel. The elegant black carriage, now coated in a fine layer of desert grit, rocked violently as it navigated the treacherous mountain pass. Her emerald green traveling dress, once pristine, now bore the stains of the harsh journey. She had traveled from San Francisco to her late father's copper mine in the heart of Apache territory, seeking to understand the legacy he had left behind. The lawyers had urged her to sell the property sight unseen, but something deep within her had demanded this pilgrimage to comprehend why her father had chosen this harsh land over civilization. The rhythmic clip-clop of hooves on stone suddenly ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that made Margaret's heart skip a beat. Through the carriage window, she watched as her driver, Coleman, slowly raised his hands above his head. The color drained from his weathered face as he stared at something beyond Margaret's view. From behind a cluster of towering red rocks emerged 6 figures on horseback, their faces painted with war paint, rifles gleaming in the afternoon sun. The Chiricahua Apache had found them. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the gravity of their situation. These were not the romanticized natives from penny novels, but hardened warriors. The leader of the war party, a man with scars crisscrossing his weathered face like a map of old battles, barked orders in Apache while gesturing toward the carriage. Coleman's voice cracked as he called out warnings to stay inside and remain motionless. The terror in his voice spoke of a man who understood exactly what Apache justice might mean. As the Apache warriors surrounded the carriage, their horses snorting and stamping in the dust, Margaret caught sight of another figure approaching from the opposite direction. This lone rider moved with a fluid grace that spoke of years spent in the saddle, his long black hair flowing behind him like a banner in the desert wind. Unlike the war party, he wore no paint, only the simple clothes of a man who had learned to live between two worlds. His name was Ayana, which meant eternal blossom in his native tongue, though the white men who knew of him called him Ghost Walker for his ability to move unseen through the desert landscape like a spirit. He'd been tracking this particular war party for 3 days, knowing that their path of destruction would only bring more suffering to his people. As an exile from his own tribe, caught between the old ways and the new, he had sworn to prevent unnecessary bloodshed whenever possible, even if it meant confronting his own people. The war party leader, recognizing Ayana despite their past differences, called out in Apache that he had no place here, that this was war party business. His voice carried the authority of tradition, but also the bitter edge of old grievances. Ayana had been cast out for speaking against raids on innocent travelers, but Ayana's response was calm but firm, his words carrying across the desert air like the whisper of wind through canyon walls. He pointed out that he saw only an expensive carriage and terrified travelers, not soldiers or miners who steal Apache land. What honor was there in killing those who could not defend themselves? The confrontation that followed was a delicate dance of words and posturing, each side testing the other's resolve. The war party leader, whose name was Kuruk, had lost his eldest son to a cavalry attack on their village just 2 moons prior. His grief had transformed into a burning desire for revenge against any white face he encountered. Kuruk's loss had been devastating, not just personally, but spiritually. In Apache culture, a father's duty was to protect his children and prepare them for life. The cavalry's bullets had stolen not just his son's life, but Kuruk's sense of purpose and honor. Every white person he encountered now represented the faceless enemy that had destroyed his world. But Ayana saw something different in the young woman's eyes. Not the arrogance or contempt he had so often witnessed in white settlers, but genuine fear mixed with something else, a spark of defiance that reminded him of his own sister, long since dead from the white man's diseases. This recognition stirred something protective within him. The standoff stretched on, tension crackling in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Coleman sat frozen on his driver's seat, sweat pouring down his face despite the dry heat. Inside the carriage, Margaret gripped the leather seat with white knuckles, her mind racing through possibilities while studying the faces of these men. Kuruk's patience finally reached its breaking point. With a sharp cry that echoed off the canyon walls, he raised his rifle and aimed it directly at the carriage window where Margaret sat. The other warriors followed suit, their weapons trained on both the carriage and the defiant exile who dared to stand in their way. But Ayana was faster. In one fluid motion that spoke of years of training and survival, he urged his horse forward and positioned himself between the war party and the carriage. His own rifle remained holstered, but his hand rested on the carved handle of his knife, a weapon that had served him well in countless battles. His voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of a man who had nothing left to lose but everything to prove. If Kuruk wanted to spill blood today, then he should spill Ayana's first. But killing innocents would not bring back his son, nor would it save their people from the fate that awaited them in this changing world. Margaret, sensing the delicate balance of the moment and the sacrifice this stranger was making for her, decided to take action that would surprise even herself. Slowly, carefully, she opened the carriage door and stepped out onto the rocky ground. Her elegant boots, designed for city streets, struggled to find purchase on the uneven surface. Standing tall and facing the war party with as much dignity as she could muster, she introduced herself as Margaret Whitmore, daughter of Thomas Whitmore. She had come to see what her father had built in these mountains, to understand why he had chosen to live so far from civilization. "If they must kill someone today," she said, "then kill her and spare her driver." The unexpected bravery of this young white woman struck the warriors like a physical blow. Even Kuruk seemed taken aback by her willingness to sacrifice herself for her companion. In Apache culture, courage was the highest virtue, and Margaret's actions, however naive they might seem, commanded a certain respect that transcended racial boundaries. Ayana seized the moment of uncertainty, addressing Kuruk, but speaking loud enough for all to hear. Did they not see the courage of a warrior in this woman, even though she knew nothing of their ways? This was not the enemy they should destroy, but someone who valued honor above her own life. Their real enemies wore cavalry blue and carried surveyors' tools. The argument that followed was conducted entirely in Apache, a rapid exchange of words that Margaret could not understand, but whose emotional intensity was unmistakable. She watched as Ayana and Kuruk faced off, their voices rising and falling like the desert wind, each man drawing on traditions and experiences that defined their very souls. The other warriors remained silent, their faces revealing nothing of their thoughts, but Margaret could sense the internal struggle taking place within the group. This was more than a simple decision about whether to kill travelers. It was a debate about the future of their people and the path they would choose in an increasingly hostile world. Finally, after what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes, Kuruk made his decision. With a sharp gesture that spoke of reluctant respect rather than defeat, he ordered his warriors to lower their weapons. But his eyes, when they settled on Margaret, burned with an intensity that made her step back involuntarily. In heavily accented English that spoke of limited but determined communication with the white world, he told her she was fortunate that the exile spoke for her today. But she should know that this desert was not safe for her kind, and she should go back to where she came from and never return to these sacred mountains. With that warning hanging in the air like a curse, the war party wheeled their horses around and rode away, disappearing into the maze of red rocks as quickly as they had appeared. The dust of their departure settled slowly, leaving behind an oppressive silence that seemed to press down on the three survivors. Coleman remained frozen on his driver's seat, his hands still raised despite the departure of the immediate threat. The encounter had aged him visibly, and Margaret could see the fear still written across his weathered features. He had served on the frontier for years, but this had been closer to death than he ever wanted to experience. Margaret found herself alone with the mysterious Apache who had saved her life. Up close, she could see the details that had been hidden by distance, the intelligent dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of knowledge and sorrow, the intricate beadwork on his leather vest, the silver cross that hung from a leather cord around his neck. This last detail surprised her most of all, evidence of the complex world that existed between the white and Apache cultures. Here was a man who had somehow bridged two worlds, adopting elements of Christianity while maintaining his native identity. The contradiction fascinated her and challenged her preconceptions about the nature of civilization. When she thanked him for saving their lives, her voice steadied despite the aftermath of terror. Ayana studied her for a long moment before responding. His English was surprisingly fluent, despite the slight accent that colored his words. He asked why she had come to this dangerous place, where the desert killed the unprepared, and many would see her dead simply for the color of her skin. Margaret explained that her father had died 3 months ago, leaving her his copper mine. The lawyers in San Francisco had told her it was valuable and advised her to sell it without ever seeing it. But she had needed to know why he had chosen to live here, so far from everything familiar. She wanted to understand what had drawn him to this harsh but beautiful land. A shadow crossed Ayana's face at the mention of the copper mine, and something in his tone made Margaret's heart sink. He asked if Thomas Whitmore was truly her father, the man who had hired Apache scouts to find water sources for his mining operation, then promised to share the profits with the local tribes, only to refuse when the mine began producing. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face as the implications of his words became clear. She knew nothing about any promises, only that her father had found success in mining and seemed to love this land despite its harshness. The possibility that his success had been built on betrayal and broken promises had never occurred to her. When she asked if Ayana had been one of her father's scouts, the question hung in the air between them, like a challenge. His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might simply mount his horse and ride away without answering. But then he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of old pain and betrayal. He had been young then, foolish enough to believe that cooperation might be possible between their peoples. He had led her father to the water sources that made the mine possible, trusting in promises that a portion of the prosperity would be shared with the Apache people who had made it all possible. Instead, when the mine began producing copper, her father had claimed that the agreement had been informal, that he owed nothing to savages who couldn't read or write contracts. He had hired cavalry to guard his operation and driven away any Apache who came seeking the promised payments. Ayana's advocacy for cooperation with her father had been seen as collaboration with the enemy by his own people. The tribal council had branded him a traitor who had been seduced by white man's promises. He was exiled from the tribe that had raised him, unable to return, but also unwelcome in the white world that had rejected him. The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had come to this desert seeking to understand her father's legacy, only to discover that it was built on betrayal and broken promises. The man she had admired and loved had been just another white man who took what he wanted from the Apache and gave nothing in return. She whispered that she didn't know, that she had thought he was an honorable man who had made his fortune through hard work and fair dealing. The knowledge sat in her stomach like a stone, heavy and uncomfortable, transforming her understanding of everything she thought she knew about her father. Ayanna was surprised by the sincerity in her voice. He had expected denials, justifications, or perhaps anger at his accusations against her father. Instead, he found himself facing a young woman who seemed genuinely horrified by the revelations about her father's character, a response that challenged his assumptions about white people. When he asked what she would do to make amends for sins she did not commit, but from which she had benefited, Margaret found herself considering possibilities that would have seemed absurd just hours before. The question forced her to confront the reality that her comfortable life had been built on the suffering of others. After a long moment of consideration, she made a decision that surprised even herself. She asked him to take her to the mine, to let her see what her father had built with Apache knowledge and Apache water. She needed to understand the full scope of what he had done before she could decide what justice looked like. The offer was unprecedented. Never before had a white person, especially a woman, shown such willingness to confront the reality of what their people had done to the Apache. Ayanna studied Margaret's face, searching for signs of deception or manipulation, but found only a genuine desire to understand and perhaps atone. He warned her that the mine was 2 days' ride away through dangerous country. The terrain itself was treacherous, and there were war parties that might not be as willing to listen to reason as Kuruk had been. Even if they reached the mine safely, seeing it would not undo what had been done. Margaret nodded, understanding the magnitude of what she was proposing. She knew the risks, but she couldn't return to San Francisco without knowing the truth. If her father's legacy was one of betrayal and theft, then she needed to understand that fully before she could decide how to move forward. Despite Coleman's protests about the danger of traveling through hostile Apache territory, Margaret's mind was made up. Her father had forfeited his right to make decisions about her life when he had lied to her about how he made his fortune. She was 23 years old and had the right to make her own choices, even dangerous ones. Ayanna agreed to guide her, but with strict conditions. She would do exactly as he said when he said it, without question. She would not question his decisions about the route or pace of travel. And she would understand that he could not guarantee her safety, only that he would do everything in his power to get her there and back alive. The next hour was a whirlwind of preparation, as Margaret's elegant traveling clothes were replaced with practical riding gear. Her side saddle was abandoned in favor of a regular saddle that would allow her to ride more securely over rough terrain. Most of her possessions were left behind with Coleman, who would drive the carriage back to safety. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret and Ayanna set out on their dangerous journey. The Apache warrior led the way on his spotted pony, a hardy animal bred for the harsh conditions of the desert. The first few hours of travel were a revelation for Margaret. Accustomed to the gentle rolling hills of California's wine country, she found herself overwhelmed by the raw beauty and harsh majesty of the Apache homeland. Towering red cliffs rose on either side of their path, carved by millennia of wind and water into fantastic shapes. Ayanna proved to be an excellent guide, choosing routes that avoided the most dangerous terrain while still making good time. He pointed out landmarks and explained the significance of various geological formations, his knowledge revealing itself in dozens of small details that would have been invisible to an untrained eye. As they rode, Margaret began to understand something of the deep connection between the Apache people and the land they inhabited. This wasn't just territory to be claimed and exploited, but a living entity that provided everything necessary for survival to those who understood its rhythms and respected its power. When darkness finally forced them to stop for the night, they made camp in a sheltered canyon where a small spring provided fresh water. Ayana built a small fire using techniques that produced virtually no smoke, a precaution against detection by hostile forces that might be tracking them. As they shared a simple meal of dried meat and parched corn, Margaret found herself studying her companion more closely. In the firelight, his features took on a timeless quality that spoke of ancient wisdom and enduring strength. The silver cross around his neck caught the light occasionally. She asked about his background, curious about the experiences that had shaped this remarkable man. Ayana was quiet for a moment before explaining that when he was 15, he had been captured during a raid on a cavalry patrol. Instead of killing him, the soldiers had taken him to a mission school run by Father Miguel. The priest had been a good man, one of the few whites Ayana had met who seemed to genuinely care about Apache welfare rather than just conversion. Father Miguel had taught him to read and write, to speak English and Spanish, and had introduced him to Christian teachings that resonated with Apache beliefs about honor and courage. But Father Miguel had been killed 3 years later when cavalry attacked the mission, claiming it was an accident, but killing the priest as he tried to protect Apache children in his care. Ayana had learned then that even good white men could not protect the Apache from the hatred of their own people. The story was another example of the tragic pattern of betrayal and violence that characterized relations between Apache and white settlers. Margaret found herself wondering how many opportunities for peaceful coexistence had been destroyed by fear, greed, and prejudice. The second day's journey took them deeper into Apache territory, through country so remote and rugged that Margaret wondered how her father had ever found his way there. The landscape was increasingly vertical, with towering mesas and deep canyons creating a maze of possible routes. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew cooler and the vegetation more diverse. Pine trees began to appear among the cacti and sagebrush, and Margaret caught glimpses of small streams carving their way through the rock. It was beautiful country, but clearly demanding in its requirements for survival. At midday, Ayana announced quietly that they were being followed. 3 riders, about 2 hours behind them, were trying to stay hidden, but their horses were leaving tracks in the soft ground near creek beds. The knowledge that they were being pursued added new urgency to their journey. Ayana began choosing more difficult routes that would slow their pursuers while testing Margaret's riding skills to their limits. She found herself navigating narrow ledges and steep descents that would have terrified her days before, but her growing confidence allowed her to push through the fear. As the afternoon wore on, the sound of their pursuers grew closer. Ayana's expression became increasingly grim as he realized that whoever was following them was skilled at desert tracking and determined to catch up. They needed to reach the mine before being caught in open country. The final push to the mine was a grueling test of endurance for both riders and horses. They climbed steadily through increasingly difficult terrain, following paths that seemed to exist more in Ayana's memory than physical reality. Margaret's horse began showing signs of exhaustion. Just as the sun was beginning to set, they crested a ridge and saw their destination spread out in the valley below. The Whitmore copper mine was larger and more extensive than Margaret had imagined, with dozens of buildings, massive piles of excavated rock, and a network of roads connecting various parts of the operation. Smoke rose from several chimneys, indicating that the mine was still in active operation despite her father's death. But it was the human cost that truly shocked Margaret. The workers were predominantly Apache, laboring under the supervision of white overseers who carried rifles and treated the native workers with obvious contempt. The environmental damage was extensive and obviously permanent. Where once there had been pristine wilderness, now there were gaping holes in the earth, mountains of waste rock, and a web of roads that scarred the mountainsides. The transformation was both impressive and appalling. Ayana grimly explained that these people were not slaves, but were paid barely enough to survive. They worked because the alternative was starvation, since her father's operation had destroyed their traditional hunting grounds and water sources. Now they had no choice but to participate in their own exploitation. As they approached the mine's main buildings, armed guards challenged them. When Margaret identified herself as Thomas Whitmore's daughter, one guard expressed surprise that she had shown up in Apache country and questioned her business with her Apache companion, using a racial slur that made Margaret's temper flare. The guard's orders were clear: no Apache was welcome on the property except for work crews under supervision. When Margaret insisted that Ayana be treated as her honored guest, the guard reluctantly directed them to the main office, where they would find Mr. Patterson, the mine supervisor who had been running operations since her father's death. Patterson proved to be exactly what Margaret had expected. Middle-aged, overweight, and radiating the kind of casual arrogance that came from wielding unquestioned authority. His eyes lingered on her travel-stained appearance with predatory appreciation, while showing undisguised hostility toward Ayana. When Margaret demanded to inspect her property and review the books, Patterson revealed complications with her plans. Her father had made certain agreements about the management of the facility, agreements that didn't necessarily transfer with ownership of the property itself. Patterson produced complex legal documents showing that her father had signed operational control of the mine to him for 10 years. The contracts were properly witnessed and legally binding, effectively stripping Margaret of any real authority over the mine's operations despite her ownership of the land. He offered to buy her ownership rights for a substantial sum, but insisted on an immediate decision due to supposed Apache raid threats. Margaret realized this was a trap designed to eliminate any challenge to his authority while she was isolated and vulnerable in hostile territory. The situation became more threatening when Patterson refused to allow Ayana inside the compound, insisting he camp outside the perimeter under guard surveillance. Margaret was assigned a cabin near the main office, with a guard posted outside, ostensibly for protection, but obviously to monitor her movements. That night, confined under what amounted to house arrest, Margaret was visited by a young Apache woman named Nayeli, who brought food, but also carried urgent warnings. She revealed that Patterson had made conditions much worse since taking control, working people longer hours for less pay and bringing in gunmen who treated workers like animals. Most horrifically, Nayeli explained that young women had been disappearing, including her own sister, who had refused a guard's advances and was subsequently assigned to dangerous work where she died in a supposed accident. 6 women and several men who spoke out against conditions had vanished in the past year. The revelations transformed Margaret's understanding of her situation. She wasn't just dealing with a dishonest business partner, but with a man apparently willing to commit murder to maintain control. Her own life might be in danger, and Ayana's certainly was, especially since Nayeli warned that Patterson's men were planning something for the next day. Before Margaret could respond to these warnings, they heard approaching footsteps. Nayeli quickly resumed her subservient manner and left with a whispered reminder that Ayana was in great danger and that the workers were hoping Margaret would be different from her father. Patterson summoned Margaret to his office that evening, where he was flanked by 2 armed men in an atmosphere of barely concealed threat. He pushed legal documents across his desk, claiming they transferred operational control to him and that even challenging them would be expensive and time-consuming. However, he offered a generous settlement for her ownership rights, enough money to live comfortably without the burden of managing a complex mining operation. But he needed her answer by dawn, after which other arrangements would have to be made, a euphemism chilling in its implications. Back in her cabin under guard, Margaret realized that both she and Ayana were likely to become the next victims of a staged Apache raid. Her only hope was to find a way to warn him and coordinate an escape before Patterson's deadline expired. Just before dawn, a soft scratching at her window revealed Ayanna, who had somehow evaded the guards to reach her cabin. He confirmed that Patterson's men were planning to kill them both and make it look like an Apache raid, having observed their preparations throughout the night. Their only escape route was through the dangerous mine tunnels that connected to a natural cave system leading to the valley below. The passages were unstable, with constant risk of cave-ins, but it was their only chance to avoid the trap closing around them. They slipped out of the cabin and through the maze of shadows surrounding the mine buildings. Ayanna moved with silent grace, leading Margaret through paths that seemed to exist more in memory than physical reality, carefully avoiding the patrolling guards who were preparing for their murderous deception. The entrance to the mine tunnels was hidden behind a pile of waste rock, concealed so effectively that Margaret would never have found it without guidance. As they descended into the darkness, they could hear the distant sounds of mining operations, the rhythmic pounding of hammers and rumble of ore carts. The underground passages were a nightmare of narrow corridors and unstable ceilings, lit only by occasional oil lamps, and filled with the acrid smell of sulfur and copper. Water dripped constantly from above, and the air was thick with dust that made breathing difficult. During their underground journey, they encountered Apache workers who recognized Ayanna and quickly stepped aside. An elderly man named Naal Nish approached them, explaining that he had worked with Margaret's father when he first arrived and wanted her to know that Thomas had not always been the man he became. Naal Nish revealed that her father had initially seemed to genuinely want cooperation with the Apache people, but money and pressure from other white men had changed him. Fear had made him cruel, as other miners and officials convinced him that cooperation was weakness and that success required absolute control. The insight was both comforting and troubling. Margaret wanted to believe her father had started with good intentions, but she also recognized that his ultimate choices were what mattered. Understanding his motivations didn't excuse his actions. Naal Nish guided them to the passage leading to natural caves, promising that the workers would remember what Margaret had tried to do and would be ready when she returned. The promise of return was both inspiring and daunting, representing a commitment to justice that would extend far beyond mere escape. The passage to the caves was even more treacherous than the mine tunnels, with lower ceilings that forced them to crawl and floors slick with moisture. Margaret's elegant clothes were reduced to tatters, and her hands were scraped raw from contact with rough stone. But gradually they began to sense changes in airflow and temperature, suggesting they were approaching the outside world. The artificial lighting gave way to natural darkness, and they could hear the distant sound of wind moving through canyon systems. Finally, after hours of underground travel, they emerged from a narrow opening onto a ledge halfway up the canyon wall. Margaret gasped with relief at breathing clean air, free from the dust and sulfur of the mine tunnels, though they were still far from safety. The descent to the valley floor was treacherous, testing Margaret's endurance and nerve as her hands bled from gripping rough rock and her muscles ached from constant strain. But knowledge that Patterson's men were probably already searching for them drove her forward through the dangerous climb. Dawn was breaking over the eastern mountains when they finally reached the valley floor, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson. But their ordeal was far from over, as they had no horses, limited supplies, and were still deep in hostile territory. The sound of approaching hoofbeats echoing through the canyon confirmed that the search had already begun. Ayanna led Margaret toward rock formations that would provide temporary concealment, but they would have to travel by day and hide at night until they could find help. Despite the approaching pursuit, Margaret suddenly stopped and declared she had to go back. Those people were depending on her to help them, and she couldn't abandon them to Patterson's cruelty. Ayana convinced her that she couldn't help anyone if she was dead, and their only chance was to reach civilization and get authorities. The next few days blurred together in exhaustion, fear, and determination as they traveled by night when possible and hid during the day. Water was scarce, and food was limited to what they could forage from the harsh landscape, but they gradually outdistanced their pursuers through Ayana's intimate knowledge of the terrain. On the third day, they encountered a cavalry patrol investigating reports of Apache activity. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Morrison, proved different from Margaret's expectations, listening to her story with growing concern and providing horses and supplies for the journey to the territorial capital. Morrison's response gave Margaret hope that there were still good people in authority who might be willing to help right the wrongs that had been committed. His promise to investigate the situation at the mine was the first step toward bringing Patterson's crimes to light. In the territorial capital, Margaret presented her evidence to the Attorney General and told her story to a newspaper reporter known for exposing mining corruption. The resulting front-page article created a sensation that reached far beyond the territorial capital. Within days, Margaret found herself at the center of a political controversy that pitted mining interests against reformers, demanding better treatment for Native American workers. The story of the rich heiress who had risked her life to expose abuse captured public imagination and generated support for reform. But it also made her a target for those who profited from the existing system. Patterson and his allies launched a campaign to discredit her testimony, questioning her sanity and morality. However, the attack backfired, as public sympathy for her courage created a groundswell of support that went beyond her specific situation. The legal battle that followed was long and complex, involving questions of contract law, territorial authority, and federal oversight of mining operations. But a federal investigation revealed the extent of Patterson's crimes, with evidence of murder, theft, and abuse leading to criminal charges and his eventual imprisonment. The Apache workers at the mine were freed from their exploitative conditions and given the opportunity to negotiate new arrangements, providing fair wages and decent working conditions. Some chose to continue working under new management, while others returned to their traditional way of life. Margaret used her inheritance to establish a fund providing education and health care for Apache families, working with tribal leaders to develop economic opportunities that respected traditional culture while providing for modern needs. Her relationship with Ayana evolved from mutual dependence to genuine partnership. Years later, historians would identify Margaret's courage and Ayana's wisdom as catalysts for change that extended far beyond a single copper mine in the Arizona mountains, becoming a symbol of the possibility for redemption and reconciliation between different worlds. The story demonstrated that true justice required not just good intentions, but the courage to act on them, regardless of personal cost or opposition encountered. It proved that even the deepest betrayals could be overcome through determination and the willingness to sacrifice for the greater good. What do you think drove Margaret to risk everything for people she barely knew? Share your thoughts in the comments below about what motivates someone to fight for justice, even when it means giving up their own comfort and safety.